Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm professor of government and the director of the Center for European Studies. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the Zaleski Lecture. Zaleski Lecture was founded in 1983, so it's 40th anniversary this year, by a gift from the estate of Ewelina Zaleski to honor her husband, August Zaleski. August Zaleski was a prominent Polish economist, politician, and diplomat. He served twice as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland before the war. And then after the war, he was the president of Poland in the Polish government in exile. Zaleski Lecture has been designed to bring the luminaries of the world of academia and politics to discuss history of and politics of modern Poland here at the Center for European Studies. And the previous Zaleski speakers included Bronisław Geremek, Norman Davis, Radosław Sikorski, Timothy Snyder, Leszek Balcerowicz, Adam Michnik, Ann Applebaum. So list goes, you know. This is really amazing opportunity for the center to bring very distinguished scholars and politicians to Harvard. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Wojciech Sadurski. Professor Sadurski is the Challis Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Sydney Law School. He's also professor at the University of Warsaw. And currently he is the McLennan Visiting Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. He has previously taught in many distinguished places, spent many years at the European University Institute in Florence. He taught at New York University Law School, Cardozo Law School, Cornell Law School, National University of Singapore, and University of Trento. So lots of travel, as you see. Professor Sadurski's interests are in jurisprudence, legal theory, philosophy of law, political philosophy, constitutional theory, and comparative constitutionalism. He is the author of almost 24 books, and the most recent ones are the Equality and Legitimacy, Oxford University Press 2008, Constitutionalism and the Enlargement of Europe, again Oxford 2012, Poland's Constitutional Breakdown, Oxford University Press 2019, A Pandemic of Populist, Cambridge 22, and forthcoming book in Oxford this year, Constitutional Public Reason. Now, Professor Sadurski is a public intellectual. He is one of the most important voices in public debates in Poland. He publishes almost every day something in Gazeta Wyborcza. Of course, current Polish government doesn't like much what Professor Sadurski has to say about the situation in Poland. So he was sued a number of times over the recent years by the Polish television, by the officials in the Polish government, and he always has those amazing speeches in the court, which end up in him being free. Right? So now his book is just being published in Poland, which includes all the pieces from Gazeta and speeches at the courts and so on. And it's called Democracy for Dark Times. We will proceed with the lecture, and then Professor Vlad Perdziu will offer some comments, and I will introduce Professor Perdziu before he speaks. So, Professor Sadurski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Grzegorz. Now that you have presented my little biography, I just wonder, who am I? Am I an author or am I rather a vexatious litigant, as they call it in law? So I'm not quite sure. But first of all, many, many thanks to Grzegorz, that is to Professor Eker, to his entire team here at the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and to Professor Vlad Periu for agreeing to comment on my presentation. Now, there are two types of presentations. There may be broad but shallow, or they may be narrow but deep. Mine will be a third genre. It will be narrow but shallow. It will be narrow, so I should warn you right at the very beginning. It will be narrow because it will be focused on one country only, on Poland. It will be shallow because I will merely assert some points rather than argue. I will announce the sort of arguments that I describe in my two books, which I develop further in my two books that Grzegorz had kindly mentioned, because this lecture is at the intersection of my Poland's constitutional breakdown, which is an account of how anti-democratic backsliding occurred in Poland. So it's sort of a case study, if you like. And second, in my Pandemic of Populists, where I cast my net wider and look at a number of countries in which that type of populist authoritarian backsliding occurred. I choose as my case studies two European countries, Poland and Hungary, two Asian countries, India and the Philippines, and two Latin American countries, Venezuela and Brazil. Brazil, of course, under Bolsonaro. So I'm trying sort of one of the attempts, one of the messages which I try to convey to my compatriots in Poland is that if it is any consolation at all, I'm not sure whether it's consolation, but who knows, maybe it is. Poland is not unique. We are not a country somehow picked up by God, you know, in his anger, or by bad faith, bad fortune. Actually, what has been going on there in the last 8 years or so, it's a relatively typical following of a broader populist script. But maybe I should say a word before I move on to talk more about Poland, about my understanding of populism. So I adopt quite unashamedly institutional rather than discursive approach to populism. Perhaps in contrast to majority of scholars who write about populism, I do not concentrate on what populists say, but what they do. And I'm much less interested in their discourse and narrative rather than as opposed to the institutional facts on the ground. That is perhaps partly a disciplinary matter. I'm a constitutional lawyer and I'm interested in institutions, rather than political philosopher, as my dear friend Jan Werner Müller, who is perhaps the most important up to now scholar in this more discursive branch of populist studies. And another reason why I'm interested in the institutions rather than discourses, and I define populism by this sort of institutional changes that occur when they come to power, is that I'm interested in populism when it actually comes to power, as opposed to populists striving for power. So, you know, when populists such as, I don't know, Marine Le Pen, or the leader of Vox Party, or whoever, when they are fighting for power, they can say whatever they want. But when actually populists come to power, like in Poland and Hungary, or before Janša in Slovenia, this is a reality check. And I'm interested in this reality as opposed to this discourse, and that is how I'll be approaching populism here. So my understanding of the institutional structure of populism is, first of all, the fundamental starting point is that populists in power derive their legitimacy their legitimacy from, by and large, free and fair elections. By and large is an important qualification here, and I have something to say about it a bit later. But by and large, they can claim, they can boast electoral legitimacy. In fact, that's the only legitimacy which they recognize in this society. But this is something that they value a great deal. So we must remember about this electoral pedigree, democratic electoral pedigree of populist authoritarians, which basically explains everything, and in particular draws a distinction between this contemporary, specifically contemporary version of authoritarianism compared to the traditional old good authoritarianism or oppression, you know, the tanks on the streets and plenty of prisoners, political prisoners, etc. The next point, so that is like a starting point. Without that, there is no authoritarian populism. And then come several characteristics which I enumerate in this slide, and that is that there is charismatic leadership, not necessarily charismatic in a conventional sense of the word, but rather in the Weberian sense of the word, that power is highly personalized, and there is basically no feasible alternative to the current leader. They don't have to be charismatic as in, in a like flamboyant or whatever. Kaczynski is not charismatic in that sense, but obviously he's charismatic in the sense of utter personalization of power. They fully undermine any separation of powers because they practice what I call mega majoritarianism, where winner takes all. Majority is equivalent or is a proxy for the totality of society, and therefore they do not believe in any dispersion of power, whether separation of powers a la Montesquieu or checks or balances in the US style, or any other forms of dispersing power. They practice what became to be known in my field as instantaneous democracy. That is, where the space between political will in the mind of the leader and the actual embodiment of it in the law in force or in state policy is extremely short. There are no road bumps between. There are no checks which consist, for example, in consultations, in trade-offs with the opposition, in any audits or other ways of slowing down the process of policy making. They are in one way anti-institutional because while they maintain the inherited institutions, they deeply change their meaning and function, something to which I will return later. And finally, the only aspect of the non-institutional character, but of this discourse nature, which I'm using in my understanding of populism, is that they all, but I think all without any exception, rely on some forms of conspiracy theories, or of, if you like, paranoia, to use Hofstadter's term. I want to say a word about approaches to understanding the sources of populism, because I believe, and that's the point I'm making in my book, that many political scientists in particular sort of underestimate the force of supply in the rise of populism. And they concentrate almost fully on demand, which may seem to be much more rational, much more objective, because demand is something about long-term and structures and systems, while supply of populism is much more sort of contingent and looks like sort of less scholarly. But I believe that the demand only somehow underdetermines the reasons why populism came to power. And I just give an example of your colleague, Professor Levitsky and Professor Way, their article of 2015. So it probably was written 2014, a year before things started happening in Poland, where they give a sort of an overview of countries which are typically not friendly to democracy, where it is unlikely that democracy, even if implanted, will prevail. And they say, well, these are countries such as poor countries with weak states, think about sub-Saharan Africa, or dynastic monarchies with oil, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, single-party regimes with strong states and high growth, China, Vietnam, very low linkages with the West, Central Asia, or which have pedigree of violent revolutions, Cuba. Now, when you look at this list, you realize that neither Poland nor Hungary fits any of these models. There are none of these, and all these models are about sort of sources for populist demand. So I think that if we stick to the demand, we fail to understand the true reasons for populism, because they have to do much more with, or at least importantly, with supply. Or maybe something, as Professor Bart Bonikowski, also I think sometime member of this team here, calls the resonance theory, that at a certain point, a little bit like in market economy, the supply must meet the demand. And so I try in my book to focus on supply, on the agency, supply of populist programs. So going back to the question about sources of populism or explanations of growth of, or emergence and growth of state authoritarian populism in countries such as Poland and Hungary, I suggest that, you know, that there is a little sort of bit of an intellectual laziness in talking about populism in singular, or populism as some sort of wave of populism, as if it were a uniform, homogeneous movement which somehow overtakes the world. Because populism is always, but always a response, probably false, dangerous, etc., but response to real problems and anxieties and concerns are always local. Then you have different populism which are triggered by different local concerns, and they are different. So I think that while the number of factors of populism is not unlimited, nevertheless it's quite large. And the point which I try to make in my book is that populists are successful when they manage to provide responses to two or more of different factors on the side of demand, such as a sense of economic insecurity and status anxiety, xenophobia, anti-elite approach, anti-globalization, and anti-modernism. These are, to me, the most typical sources of authoritarian populism in different worlds, but in different countries they occur with different intensity, in different configurations and different constellations. So, for example, in Poland, I think the factor number 1, that is status anxiety, and factor number 4, anti-globalism, had very little impact upon the Law and Justice Party coming to power. In turn, the 3 most important factors which triggered populist emergence in Poland were, first of all, anti-elite approach, which strangely, something that we can discuss later, persisted into the second term. So people who were already elite managed somehow to convince the people that they are always outsiders, you know, and that this elite who have been pushed out of the government still, you know, those cosmopolitan, liberal, arrogant elites, that they still hold all the levers of power. The second was xenophobia, which may be called nativism, in particular expressed in anti-immigrant sentiments, a point slightly recently weakened by the influx of Ukrainian immigrants, a point which I will raise later, and most importantly, anti-modernism. This type of anti-enlightenment, anti-liberalism, anti-rationality approach, certain nostalgia for the old days of dominance of religion, of traditional structures of authority, both in family and in the state, etc. So all that came against the background of toxic, where do I go? Of of toxic polarization. Of course, polarization in itself, there's nothing wrong about it. It may be another word for diversity or pluralism. But this sort of toxic polarization, not just in Poland, but we are interested now in Poland, has three characteristics, which put together render this polarization truly invidious and dangerous. First of all, it is radical. That is, it is total. There is very little, if any, overlap between the warring factions. The warring factions are more or less symmetrical in their power. In the recent opinion polls about whom are you going to vote for, 46% of polls mentioned one of the Democratic opposition party, 45% Law and Justice, and the extreme right-wing Confederation Party. So it's almost like 50-50. There is a complete divide. There is very little flow between these groups. Secondly, it's negative in the sense that the hatred to the other group is stronger, more intense than the commitment to your own people and your own leaders. And finally, it is moralized in the sense that it is not that we believe that they are simply wrong. That's normal in a democracy, right? But we believe that they are worse than wrong. They are evil. They are wicked. So this combination of these three forms is a very fertile, of these three aspects of polarization is an extremely fertile ground for Polish populism. There are some aspects of the, if you like, anatomy of institutional trajectories, institutional changes in Poland, which render it almost obscure. I would say almost invisible to many people, both inside and outside. One is that changes have been incremental. Okay? That they have been, it was an evolution rather than a clear turning point. So any change taken on its own hasn't struck many people as being particularly worrying. It's only exposed that we could see that some threshold has been passed. The second is that the most toxic aspect of those various changes, legislative changes, because that's what I have in mind in particular, was in the mutual interaction between those different the different aspects, rather than each of them taken at a time. So to any legislative changes, whether it's about courts or electoral commissions or whatever, taken in Poland, the defenders would say, but wait a moment, this is just like in Belgium, and this is like in Spain, and this is like in Canada, which is correct. But put together, they have created total dissolution of the structure of democracy. And the third point, important for us, constitutional lawyers, is that they, by and large, have left institutions intact. Chavez here was different, and that is why Venezuela under Chavez, and in particular later under Maduro, are not typical cases of populist authoritarianism, as I understand it here. But normally, they don't act as Bolsheviks, that is, they erase all the institutional structure. Rather, they keep those institutions, but fundamentally change their meanings, which is usually expressed in this idiom of hollowing out of institutions. So in my book on Poland, in my book in this most recent book, A Pandemic of Populists, I provide a certain taxonomy of what populists do to institutions in order to hollow them out. And if there is something relatively original in this book, and I don't know what Vlad will say in his comments, so let me just disarm him in advance, it is this, to provide some sort of anatomy of institutional changes. And I suggest that when you look at Poland, you will see the whole menu of hollowing out of institutions, which includes first capture. You just place your own people in the old institutions, and they start doing what you want them to do. Court packing would be one typical example of it. Duplication, you create new institutions parallel to constitutional institutions, because in Poland you cannot change the constitution, the ruling party doesn't have sufficient supermajority. So what do? You create new institutions, and these new institutions, statutory institutions, and you have a power, of course, by simple majority to establish new institutions, they overshadow the existing constitutional institutions. This is the question of example of media boards. Third is erosion. Now, you maintain an institution, but you starve it of funds and reduce its competences. The case of ombudsman. Migration, as a migration of files from, in a sort of computer jargon, of files from one place to another, you simply take an institution, but place it in a different place of the structure, and therefore you change the traditional, say, channels of accountability. That's the case of the Office of Prosecutor, Public Prosecutor in Poland, very important office, which sort of overnight, at the end of 2015, became part of the structure of Ministry of Justice, with Minister of Justice being ex officio Prosecutor General. And finally, internal restructuring. You maintain the institution, but change often in a way obscure to the outside public, because these seem like technical legal details. You change its internal structure and way of functioning. The Supreme Court is an example of that. And as you would have expected, courts have been the main object of the populist, authoritarian anger and aggression. And we can see why, because courts in general, and it happens everywhere in populist authoritarian states, because courts present a credible alternative legitimacy. That is my theory about the reasons, the motives for this capture of courts by populists. They are legitimate. Populists are legitimate, but electorally illegitimate, and they cannot tolerate any other sources of legitimacy. And we know that a well-functioning democracy requires multiple sources of legitimacy, perhaps with the electoral legitimacy dominating, but not being the only one, so the exclusive one. So you must have legitimacy based on efficiency, legitimacy based on talent, and, as in the case of courts, legitimacy based on impartiality of judges compared with their professionalism. But this is a big challenge to this sort of totalizing, if you like, approach by populists. So we have seen everywhere, but now we are interested in Poland, all sorts of strategies to undermine and defeat judicial branch. In my book on Poland, the title I give to my chapter on courts is The Least Resilient Branch, which is a deliberate paraphrase of probably the most famous book in American constitution law, The Least Dangerous Branch, by Alexander Bickel of early 1960s. But the other side of the same coin, that courts are really the least dangerous. You know, they have no power of enforcement themselves, they don't have independent budget, etc., is that they are the most vulnerable. They are the least resilient, and that's what we have seen in Poland after 2015. Courts, from offering a distinct, separate form of political legitimacy, in particular from the role of being anti-majoritarian actors, that is, actors which constrain majority in the name of the law and in particular of the Constitution, became willful enablers of the will of the majority. So, in a sense, the fundamental, especially when you look at Constitutional Tribunal in Poland, its role changed 180 degrees from, at least under ideal theory, being this counter-majoritarian force, countervailing power, so to speak. It became a very useful helper of the executive and of the legislative majority, which helps to reduce political costs of decisions. And one example that I like to use in this context is that of the Constitutional Tribunal's decision in late 2020, when it has more or less for all practical purposes rendered almost all abortion illegal in Poland. All with the exception of abortion based on threat to mother's life, which has traditionally been about 1 up to 2% of the actual abortions in Poland. All others, especially about the genetic defects of the fetus, have been rendered illegal. This is something that the government didn't want to decide through the parliament because it expected the protests. It expected that political costs would be very high. On the other hand, it has been and still is under strong ideological pressure from the Catholic Church. And therefore, it sort of conferred this function upon Constitutional Tribunal, which of course willingly performed that. But here is a point. If courts not merely lose their independence, but also lose the appearance of the independence, the traditional function for courts, which is described in constitutional theory as a blame game, is no longer possible. That is, blame game means politicians often like to impose upon courts certain decisions which politicians don't like to make because of the political costs related to it. And judges can do it because they have all sorts of privileges which immunize them from those costs. But if people know that courts are not independent, then the blame game cannot work because people know where the decision was made. So when in late 2020 Polish Constitutional Tribunal has taken this horrendous decision, there were instant, spontaneous demonstrations of women and men against this ruling, but those protesters did not go to Aleja Szucha, the street where Constitutional Tribunal has its headquarters, but they went straight direct to Mickiewicza Street in Żoliborz, where the leader-in-chief, Jarosław Kaczyński, resides. Because they knew that that's where the power is. And, it was almost like, who do you think you are kidding type of approach. Okay, this is a little bit of self-promotional photo referring to what Grzegorz had said, but it's meant to illustrate the approach of authoritarian populists to law. Law is used in accordance with this beautiful maxim of Oscar Benavides: everything for my friends, for my enemies, the law. So the law is used in order to protect the ruling elite against all sorts of corruption, nepotism, etc., misdeeds, and on the other hand, to harass and prosecute independent judges, prosecutors, public commentators. That's the role of discriminatory legalism, which is the concept coined by Professor Kurt Weiland in the context of his analysis of Latin American populism. Let me say a few words about the impact of the war in Ukraine, which is sort of like a separate topic before I move to my final reflections about the forthcoming elections. So I think that it is a very, very important point, of course. And we cannot just talk about Poland without mentioning the war against Ukraine, the aggression against Ukraine. I see here four important aspects of this war. First of all, the Poland-Hungary rift, which I think is very good from the point of view of Democrats. And that is because up to the war actually, up to 24 February 2022, Polish and Hungarian government in tandem became sort of engine for promoting right-wing populism also in Western Europe. There were meetings, there was funding, there were all sorts of events which were meant to create some sort of sponsorship over Salvini then, and then Meloni, or Marine Le Pen, etc. Now this rift, which placed Poland and Hungary on two different sides of the barricades, means that that engine for populism has been somehow extinguished for the time being. My sense is that the rift is relatively shallow, but it's there, and it's a good thing. The next point is that there has been in Poland an understandable, something to be expected, rallying around the flag phenomenon. And the government used it very cynically and rather shrewdly, saying, well, okay, you may have all sorts of problems with us, the rule of law, all this stuff. Now is not the time to raise all these things, because now is the time to rally in the face of the common enemy, and the enemy is just across the border. And unfortunately, it worked to some extent, and it's interesting that already after 24th February, for example, President of Poland intensified his actions of appointing illegally new judges at a recommendation of an unconstitutional, illegal National Council of Judiciary. So that has been seen through, but the government tried to use that. The third point is that there has been big influx of Ukrainians into Poland, and I think that they will, at a certain point there were 2 million, I think at least 1 million will stay. That's a prediction. And in my books, it's a very good thing. You know, Poland has been distressingly homogeneous after the Second World War, and that to some extent created all the xenophobia and nativism. I think that the fact that there are all these Ukrainians there, mainly Ukrainian women and children, of course, that there are Ukrainian kids in schools, that when you walk along Polish streets, you hear lots of either Ukrainian language or Polish with this beautiful, soft Ukrainian accent. I think it may have important impact upon Polish public consciousness. And the last point is about Polish government styling itself, pretending that it will be some sort of sponsor of Ukraine in its road to the EU. Of course, everyone knows that Ukraine will not become a member of the European Union anytime soon. It may take decades, but the very fact of being a candidate will be an extremely important political phenomenon in Ukraine. And when I was in Ukraine a few days ago, actually last week, I asked some people, but how do you perceive the fact that you will be sort of chaperoned or brought into European Union with the aid of a government which is in huge conflict with the European Union and which sort of violates European values? And I got different responses. So when I asked these politicians, for example, one of my interlocutors was member of Ukrainian Duma, not Duma, Supreme Council, that is the parliament, Mr. Stefanchuk, Mykola Stefanchuk. He said, oh, well, it doesn't matter. You know, whoever helps us join the European Union will appreciate it. We don't look into the internal Polish affairs. But when I spoke to people who didn't need to be that diplomatic, such as probably one of the most important Ukrainian public intellectuals and political scientists, Yaroslav Hryniuk, whom probably some people know here or know of. He told me an opposite story. He said, I certainly hope that by the time we start talking to EU about joining EU, Poland will not have this authoritarian populist government that it has now. I don't want them to help us enter the EU. If anything, our strategic, and here's the word, our strategic alliance will be with Germany, not with Poland. So somehow this response, I think, highlights here these big problems in this triangle: Poland, Ukraine, the EU. So that brings me to the question of the position of Poland in the EU. And I would like to make just 2 points, because as I had promised, it all will be incredibly shallow and just an overview of argument, and I have only 6 minutes left, maybe a little bit more because Grzegorz took probably 5 minutes. So I have, say, 10 minutes left, and I'll finish by then. I want to make 2 points. Many people on the democratic or liberal or left-wing side, however you call it, anti-law and justice party, say they are preparing Polexit, which is a Polish version of Brexit. I think it's a mistake. We can make this argument for rhetorical reasons, but I think it's a mistake. I do not think that PiS, which is Polish acronym for law and justice, really would like to remove Poland from the EU because Poles are too much pro-European, and especially Polish peasants, who are one of the main constituencies of PiS, largely rely on various EU subsidies, etc. So it's not that PiS wants to remove Poland from EU, rather, and this is my smart formula, which you may quote if you like, it wants to remove EU from Poland. Meaning, it wants to return to the time in which EU was just an international rather than supranational organization on a free market. No policing of the rule of law. No things such as democracy. No such things as the Charter of Fundamental Rights. No such things as the judicial independence. But of course it cannot be done. I mean, there's no way of turning the clock back. And so the only alternative, short of Poland removing itself from the EU, which it won't, or removing Poland from the EU, which the EU cannot do, legally speaking, there will be some de facto form of integration at deux vitesses, what's the word, in two speed, right? That is, there will be a periphery and there will be center. And Poland certainly will be at the periphery. And the second point is about the other side of the story, that is EU towards Poland. So I have been claiming for a long time that the EU has a big and sufficient toolkit in its legal and political arsenal to produce effective policing of the rule of law and democracy in its member states. The problem is not with the toolkit, because it's very broad. It's Article 7 procedure, it's the rule of law framework, these are the infringement actions by the Commission to the Court of Justice of European Union. You name it, it's there. It's just a matter of political will, which is missing for various reasons, which we can discuss later. But I think that this political will has somehow became bolstered lately by EU refusal to dispense recovery fund grants to Poland on the basis of Poland's violation both of conditionality related to those recovery funds and of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now I need to make now a quick strategic decisions about what to remove from in these last 3 minutes from my prepared notes and how to end. And I think I won't go into the election story. We can talk about it later. As I said, I just returned both from Ukraine and from Poland, and I'm sort of sick and tired with these interminable discussions about who will win the election, and especially whether the opposition will be united or will not be united. I'm sure that those of you who follow Polish media are also sick and tired. So I really don't want to go into it. This is my story. This is a brief outline of various options under today's surveys. But today's surveys, of course, will change tomorrow and after tomorrow. So now it is that the PiS and Confederation, two right-wing parties, which no doubt, mark my words, no doubt will be in coalition government if it's necessary for PiS after the elections. Now they have just 1% less brought together than all the democratic parties combined. So it's 45 to 46. But it translates into a huge victory for Law and Justice and the Confederation because of the vagaries of the Polish electoral system and so-called D'Hondt way of translating raw vote into seats in the parliament. So if today's situation persists, which it will not, impossible. I mean, there are still at least 6 months to the election. The Democratic opposition gets more votes, but loses the election. Without any, and we yet haven't mentioned any aspects of the unfairness and electoral fraud. That's just the electoral system. That's exactly what happened in 2019, where the Democratic parties put together got over 800,000 more votes in the parliamentary election, in the election to the lower chamber, but have lost to PiS, which came united with its coalition members, and which therefore won easily the majority. If PiS wins, if Law and Justice wins, which is possible and which is probable, what will happen? There will be these at least 3 aspects of consolidation of populist authoritarianism. Institutional consolidation. The remaining independent institutions will be eroded or suppressed. Think about municipal presidents of towns, or mayors of towns rather, that is local self-government. Think about independent NGOs. Think about some independent media, etc. So, just look at the script. Look at Budapest. Look at Hungary, and you'll know the script for what PiS will do if it gets into the 3rd term. There will be, secondly, political consolidation. I mean, the opposition people will say, look, how long can you stay in the opposition backbenches? I mean, we have only one life, we should do maybe something else than be here. And perhaps most distressingly, there will be all forms of social, psychological consolidation, which are well known and well recognized. For example, each new case of corruption, of scandal, of nepotism, etc., will be somehow increasingly trivialized, because there will be this phenomenon described by Moynihan as defining pathology down. So it will be a very dark hour, and that's the title of my Polish book, which Grzegorz had mentioned in his introduction. So this is a little commercial break, if you like, to those of you who read and speak Polish. I say all that in this book, but really I show it here under the pretext that it has this beautiful cover with a photo by Chris Niedenthal. But I don't want to end this lecture with this very gloomy accent. And I want to end my lecture with 2 beautiful quotes from 2 great Poles, a philosopher and a poet. Leszek Kołakowski, in his sort of half-in-jest essay about devil in history, said this: "The struggle between the devil and God in history is not a merry spectacle. The only comfort we have comes from the simple fact that we are not passive observers or victims of this contest, but participants as well. And therefore, our destiny is decided on the field on which we run. Our destiny and agency." 2 important items here. It's all about destiny now, because the 3rd term of PiS will be horrible tragedy for my home country. But also there is agency. It really depends on us. And finally, a quote from Czesław Miłosz, from his piece, What I Learned from Jean Hirsch. And I mean, there are 3 items in this piece that he learned from Jean Hirsch, but this is the most relevant to us now. And this is that in our lives, we should not succumb to despair. For the past is never closed down and receives the meaning we give it by our subsequent acts. The elections of 13, perhaps October, will be this act which will give a meaning to what has been happening in Poland over the last 8 years. Whether it was only an episode, a much too long episode, but still an episode, and some sort of aberration, pathology in Polish democracy, or beginning of those dark times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wojciech. This was amazing. lecture, and we are grateful to Vlad Perju, who kindly agreed to offer some comments. Professor Perju is at Boston College Law School. He has PhD from Harvard Law School and degrees from Sorbonne and Bucharest. He published widely in the top law journals on constitutional theory, comparative constitutional law, European integration, comparative law, and jurisprudence. Professor Perju is a long-time associate of the Center for European Studies, and we are very proud of it.
So thank you very much. It's a very great pleasure to be here and comment on Professor Sadursky's lecture and the two books on which it is based. I recommend them highly. They're among the best books available really on the topic. Just like the lecture you have heard, they are broad and they are deep. Okay, they're not narrow, they're not shallow, they're detailed, they're erudite. They're immensely wise, and they're truly illuminating. I start my comments with a distinction that is foundational to Wojciech's analysis between discursive and institutional approaches. You have heard it. It's tremendously helpful to be able to think along this way. But I think that there's more behind the distinction that meets the eye. From the institutional perspective, which Wojciech adopts, an emphasis on discourse is both over and under-inclusive. It is over-inclusive because it captures the political experience of talk but no action, or little action. For those who think that institutions held up pretty well, in the United States during Trump or in Brazil during Bolsonaro, these are good examples. Now, the discursive approaches are also under-inclusive. They do not pick up cases of less talk, but a lot of action. So think here of early Orban. Orban who unleashes the blitzkrieg against the Hungarian constitutional state right as he returns into office 2010, 2011, 2012. Now, shift the perspective to the discursive perspective and ask from that perspective what the institutional approach looks like. And it seems to me that it looks both over and under-inclusive. It is over-inclusive because it identifies institutional reforms that are the outcome of tough political battles, but without any authoritarian animus. It is about, they're about giving an advantage to the political forces that happen to have power at a particular point in time. FDR's court packing plan in the US, or recent proposals to reform the US Supreme Court are good examples here. The institutional approach is also under-inclusive, and that is what interests me here. It assumes that discourse that does not result in institutional reform is of lesser interest or relevance. It's fireworks, bombastic stuff that draws attention. It's not really the real thing. Now, there are a few ways in which discourse is impactful in itself. We know, of course, toxic discourse poisons the public sphere. It erodes mechanisms of meaning production and reproduction that are critical for social integration. Again, Trump, Bolsonaro, but perhaps an even better example would be the impact of Berlusconi on Italian public life. See Maurizio Viroli's masterful Liberty of Servants. But there's another way in which discourse, talk, matters. It matters as part of the theoretical ecosystem. Ideas, mindsets, theoretical frameworks, they matter. They matter in complex ways, though differently throughout the different stages of the takeover. And here I completely agree with Wojciech that the taxonomy that he puts up there it's really original and deeply interesting. Capture, duplication, erosion, migration, restructuring, consolidation. Historians routinely reflect on these matters. Paxton's 5 stages of fascism is relevant at the level of methodology. Ideas matter early on before fascism comes into power, not so much later. So one constantly has to shift the standpoint. Ideas, discourse, practices, institutions in understanding the historical phenomenon. An emphasis on ideology early on gets replaced at stage 2 and 3. So it's not just a matter of how or which ideas matter, but also a when they matter. It seems with populism, ideas matter quite a bit at the later stages of consolidation, in this blend of institutional, political, social, psychological factors. Here's what I mean. Suppose in today's context that you're in power and you want to entrench yourself there for as long as you possibly can. You acquiesce to regular elections, free, by and large, fair. You do it for purely strategic reasons, but you surely don't want to lose. You surely don't want to get kicked out of office. So how do you ideally go about entrenching yourself? Is capturing the judiciary through laws that undermine judicial independence your best entrenchment tool? I'm not sure. It's a great, very powerful tool. Look at what's been happening in Poland. But is it the best? Because you risk ending up with mass protests, with the international community coming after you, with a lot of trouble. Look at what's happening in Israel. Look the mass protest in Poland, mass protest in Romania. Perhaps a better way would be constitutional change if you can pull it off. Not the case in Poland, as we have heard, but certainly a method of choice in Latin America and in Hungary. That requires popular mobilization, enough drive to see this thing through. The problem, again, is that once constitution making becomes fair game, the constitution you enact can also be undone, just as you have undone the previous constitution. So if we move the game at the constitutional level, you can trust that everybody's going to be playing that game. Perhaps there's a better way. This better way is not just about rules, which can change, but about a way of making sure that whatever the rules are, their meaning is advantageous to you. Mm-hmm. You know that rules don't interpret themselves, they're underdeterminate, all that. They need to be applied and interpreted. But if you can colonize the minds of the interpreters and more, that is the ultimate prize. Part of this story is familiar. This is how the United States Supreme Court has become captured. We know the ingredients: money, lots of it, a certain amount of ruthlessness, again, not hard to come by, and ideas. Ideas, theories, frameworks. You see how neither the discursive nor the institutional approaches are quite calibrated to capture this entirely. Now, I said the part of the story is familiar, only part of it. There's another dimension to this story that reaches even deeper than colonizing minds. It is a tremendous contribution of Wojciech's books, that it helps us to see that. This is the part of the books that talk about alternative legitimacy, literal democracy, discriminatory legalism. So what is that about? This is about the leader using the tools of the state, the laws, to carve out the people it wants. It's sovereign of choice. It is discrimination, but used as a simplification technique. The state cuts through unmanageable complexity by essentially forcibly depluralizing the polity. Think about Jan Müller's populism as moralized anti-pluralism. Now, don't think just of voting. If you only look there, gerrymandering and all that, you might still find regular elections by and large fair. But look deeper. Look at how the state selectively empowers and disempowers. Abortion bans that disempower women. Dobbs, the story about Poland that you've heard. Look at the relationship and the reinterpretation of the relationship between religion and the state, a particularly effervescent area, both in the US and Poland and many other places. Look at the demise of affirmative action here and the many forms of discrimination in Polish law. Think of family values, book bans, battles over school curriculum, even the push for homeschooling. Think of the myriad ways of empowering the executive. Underpinning all this is a conception of self-government. Theorists of democracy have long written about ocular democracy, about how people participate by watching. Someone with whom you think you share an identity is in power. And so are you, sort of. Only that now this becomes a matter of constitutional self-government. Call it identitarian constitutionalism. You might think of this as a pathology of constitutionalism. I hope you do. And pathological it is from the perspective of liberalism. But it is a very real tool with which the state implements very real policies. How this tool became available, how constitutionalism has been so perverted, these are terribly hard questions. Holmes, the great American jurist, famously said, even a dog knows the difference between being kicked and being stumbled over. We seem to have forgotten how to make that distinction. Wojciech's emphasis on literal democracy, his explanation about forms of government that are devoid, deprived, drained of purpose, direction, aim, are very useful in getting us to think, to rethink those foundations of constitutionalism. Now, one should not be a fatalist. There are many forces that are seeking to counteract this. If I had time, I'd mention the astonishing developments in European law that have been mentioned here by Wojciech. The way in which that entire body of law, oftentimes prompted by development in Poland, has been going through a phenomenal refoundation, akin in its effervescence only with the early developments of European law in the 1960s and 70s. But I need to end. So I want to end, like Wojciech, with Kolakowski. The struggle between the devil and the good is not a merry spectacle. Tony Judd once told an anecdote. He reported attending a lecture by Kolakowski entitled The Devil in History. Apparently, it took a while for the audience to grab onto Kolakowski's train of thought, struggling to unpack the metaphor, until the judge said, "You realize that there was no metaphor. Kolakowski actually meant the devil. Evil," he said, "is not contingent, but a stubborn and unredeemable fact. The devil is part of our experience. Our generation," he said, "had seen enough of it for the message to be taken extremely seriously." With Russia's wars in Ukraine, with so much at stake for the future of the world and of Europe, including Poland, in the coming period, Kolakowski's thought seems like a fitting end to these brief remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
As you see, hanging out with the lawyers has distinctive intellectual advantages. Let me open the floor for questions. We will take few, and then we will go back to Wojciech, and maybe then you may respond to some of the comments Vlad made. Steve, please.
Yeah, Steve Hansen, visiting scholar here. Thank you for the brilliant lecture. So I was thinking about the term populism when you shift from the discursive version of that, like Hasmuda and people like that, to the institutional version that you, I think, powerfully articulate. Eventually, does the term stop being the right one? In other words, when you're building a state, in effect, the third term of peace, that would be based on these principles, would it still be populist or would it just be traditional? Would it be built on sort of Weberian traditional legitimation, personalistic power, arbitrariness of the ruler, and the control of the state as a family business, to use patrimonialism as a kind of ideal type? In which case populism would stop working. And I'll give you just a quick anecdote about that. I was reading an analysis of Netanyahu's struggles at the moment in the newspaper the other day, and the commentator said, "It's time for the people of Israel to rise up and overthrow the populist leadership of Israel." As soon as I read it, I said, there's something funny here about populism as it gets stretched.
So, oh no, let's take more. Yeah, up to you, up to you.
Why don't we take
Sure.
one more?
More, really.
Boyan, please.
Yeah, Bojan Garic. So thank you, Wojciech. This was a brilliant lecture, and I want to push you a little bit on one aspect. I know that it's in your book, but you haven't spoken about it today, and it presents to me like also one of the puzzles of the Polish story, not only of the Polish, which is the fact that despite the fact that what you said, you still have 40 to 45% of the Poles that vote for this party, despite the fact that they do all the things that you mentioned, but they do also something else, and you haven't mentioned that, and you can have a large conversation about it, whether it's proper, whether it's not proper, but if you look a little bit at the way economists look at the situation, the level of inequality has decreased in Poland in the last 3-4 years. The hugely popular programs, whatever we think about them, 500 zloty plus and pension reforms and all that stuff, really strengthened support for peace. Not only in the countryside, also in the parts of, as the British famous historian Timothy Garton Ash calls it, Polska B, the less developed part of Poland. So. And then you compare the Polish situation with Hungary, and you see the biggest mistake of the Hungarian united opposition in the last election was that they focused mostly on the rule of law, on the legal story, while almost completely neglecting this economic aspect of the situation. They didn't actually present much of the alternative ideas. So I fear, the way I read the situation, is that this is something that potentially could really undermine the strength and the power of the Polish opposition in the next elections.
Yeah. Let me start with Bojan. We've had these conversations, haven't we? and we will continue. Of course, I haven't touched or haven't discussed all the important aspects about the ongoing popularity of law and justice and ongoing weakness of the opposition. But I have left these issues, a social welfare approach, which parades as in sort of dignitarian terms, that it is recognition of dignity of people, etc., because I hate it. And I would have to explain why, and there wouldn't be enough time. I think that this redistribution alleged by peace, by law and justice, in recognizing the dignity of people who had been so far disregarded and not looked after, it's based on a huge, huge lie. And the lie is that you can cure, that you can somehow even speed up the redistribution and bringing about equality by cash handouts. And that's not the way to go, because those cash handouts under inflation lose and lose increasingly their value, and those people who get those extra notes will need to compete and will lose in the free market for education, social care, and medical care. So rather than, but all this money which is being used by the government in the form of cash handouts could be much, much more productively and much more egalitarian in its nature, equally used by production of public goods. In this sense, I am a social democrat. I believe in the country using tax mechanism, for example, for redistribution, for more equality, equality of opportunity, or for creating public goods. But the peace was doing just the opposite. It hasn't built new schools, new good hospitals and other facilities, but gave people cash, saying, well, look after yourselves in the market. So it's like re-privatization of all these goods. And we know why they did. A, it's much easier to do. I mean, it doesn't take any special skills, managerial talents, design, planning, etc., just giving out cash. Secondly, it produces instant gratification. So people are immediately happy rather than waiting for all these things being produced. So yes, they are using that type of rhetoric, but I believe it's a deceptive rhetoric, and that's why I didn't want to go into it. But obviously you are right. If one were to paint a full picture of the real reasons why the popularity of peace remains at the level, even say just over 30%, which is now. They got 44% vote in the election 2019. Now they have about 34%. So they've lost 10%. So let's not exaggerate how much they maintain their popularity. Yeah, but there is worrying case. So there is a combination of also factors. And perhaps one of the most important factors is this ruthless indoctrination and propaganda through state media, which are basically accessible everywhere through their signal, while their private competitors cannot reach all the viewers. So it's a complex picture. To Steve Hansen, why I would call these populist states rather than traditional states, I think that the word populist in this aggregate populist authoritarianism plays an important role, separate. It does some separate work without which we cannot really understand what's going on there. And that is mainly through the fact that the governments want to be genuinely popular. They don't want to rule just by fear or by violence. They want to be popular, partly for reasons that Bojan mentioned rightly, partly because they want to maintain this electoral legitimacy, which is not fiction. Even if we allow for all the manipulations with the electoral system, Orban style, still support by a large number of Hungarians for Orban or Poles for Kaczynski is a real thing, and they want to be liked. They want to be liked through their social policies. They want to be liked through sort of xenophobia and anti-others, through appeals to radical nationalism, but also through, for example, various ways of paranoid style in politics, I have started called it, by conspiracy theory. If there was conspiracy, if there was a plot against Polish president which resulted in crash in Smolensk, or if George Soros really wants to destroy the Hungarian essence of Hungary, then we want to be on the side of the defenders of all this. They want to be. So I think that populist is something that I would really not give up in this description. And I'm extremely grateful to Vlad for all your comments, which I have written down in detail and I'll think about. I don't think there is much disagreement between us. It is true that when it comes to institutional restructuring, it also can, calling it populist may be over-inclusive and under-inclusive. However, if we go into this sort of over-inclusive part of it, and look, for example, at court packing proposed by, or planned and then abandoned by FDR, again, it wasn't part of a comprehensive attempt to destabilize democracy in the United States, as is the case in those populist regimes. And when it comes to under-inclusive, I agree. I maybe protested a bit too much and exaggerated this part that I'm interested in institutions rather than in words. Of course, words matter and ideas matter, and especially toxic ideas and conspiracy theories and all the justifications against others, exclusionary, discriminatory discourse, they matter immensely. I have just, and that's my way of withdrawing slightly from the strength of what I've said, is maybe for the reasons of my discipline, what I've been educated. I really look at the institutions, what happened to them. But obviously, institutional dismantlement doesn't come in separation from the words which justify it. So thank you for your comments, and I'll definitely reflect on all this.
Thank you. My name is Miguel Rodriguez. I'm a professor at Suffolk University, where I teach about Europe's central role in the world order since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and I'm a retired US diplomat. My question is as follows. When you take 6 majoritarian democracies, and by majoritarian I mean, just like you described, parliamentary majority but with poor regard for minority rights and checks and balances, 6, Poland, Hungary, Israel, Turkey, the modern name Turkey, India, and Brazil under Bolsonaro.
Poland, Hungary.
Hungary, Israel,
Yes.
Turkey, India, and Brazil under Bolsonaro. I always thought that the deciding factor was the degree of education among the population. But you have three highly educated societies, Poland, Hungary, and Israel. You have India and Brazil, and especially India with a high rate of extreme poverty and illiteracy, and Turkey in between. What is the deciding factor, in your opinion, that causes a democratic population to veer in favor of a majoritarian model as opposed to a constitutional model? I mean, in the wealthy West, you have France and Germany and Belgium, for example, versus Poland and Hungary. In Asia, you have Indonesia, where governments regularly give up power, but now we have Modi, who mirrors much of what's happening in Poland. You know, one group versus the other, they both have rich and poor countries. What's the deciding factor?
Well, so first of all, I don't think that the level of education here is crucial, because even if in India or the Philippines the level of education used by usual standards is lower than in more developed countries, the sort of sense of political awareness is extremely high. And that is what matters, I think. Just as in Myanmar before Burma, these are very politically astute and sensitive people. Even informally speaking, they didn't have access to good education. So I do not think that this is a variable which is particularly relevant here. That is why I urged recognition of the supply factor. So that if we say, why in the Philippines and not in Indonesia? They are almost next door to each other, right? They are different in many ways. Philippines is largely Catholic, Indonesia is largely Muslim, etc. But why? Or why it happened in India, but it has not happened elsewhere. Okay, so I think that the fact that at certain point, why Trump occurred in the United States? There was nothing predetermining his coming to power. There just happened to be a movement and a group of people who are shrewd enough, who are very determined, who have read public sentiments, especially those negative sentiments of anger or of religious bigotry, as is the case in India, or fear about law and order, as is the case in the Philippines. Hence, Duterte, president who boasted how many people he killed, and so on and so on. That is, these are things which are contingent but important. That's why I plea for the higher recognition of demand, of supply factors that has been part of the conventional wisdom. But I cannot give, each of these countries probably belongs to a slightly different category. Why in Brazil but not in Argentina? I don't know, area study scholars will explain, but still I think that all these explanations will be underdetermining, because we need to look at the contingent, hence unpredictable factors.
Let me bring a couple of questions. Madam, please.
Yes. Peace has been incredibly skilled at using micro changes, even at the level of parliamentary procedure, to sort of institute a death by 1,000 cuts strategy. And I'm wondering, do you think that there are institutional strategies to guard against the abuse of the ability of parliaments to make legislative and procedural changes, not like to constitutionalize everything, but are there institutional strategies to guard against that flexibility, or is it sort of like the phenomenon of water finding the cracks and inevitably working its way down?
Thank you so much for both of you. A great set of presentations and response. I'm visiting here from Israel for the year, so this is all very relevant. Some of us in the room heard a talk earlier, 2 hours ago, upstairs, which is all about discourse. Your talk here is all about institutions, so I want to go back to your response here. One thing you didn't mention was actually the past 100 years, the past 80 years in Poland in particular, World War II, the Holocaust, the communist period, and the public battles over history. Did you not mention them because in your mind they're not so relevant to the rise of this populist regime and the majoritarian regime in Poland? And if they're not relevant, then why is PiS so obsessed with museums, history in the past in Gdansk and Warsaw and other places? So this gets back to your wonderful response and backward-looking discourse and institutions.
Maybe you could respond to those two and then we'll bring closer.
Yeah. When it comes to institutional precautions against these abuses of constitutional democracy, I believe that there may be some strategies at the margins, at the fringes. I mean, there are all sorts of aspects of constitutional design which may make it more difficult and more costly to authoritarians to abuse constitutionalism. Ross Dixon and David Landau recently had a great book about abusive constitutionalism, and they suggest a number of such strategies. In my own book about Poland, I suggest, well, maybe one of the ways in which constitutional dismantlement of democracy was possible in Poland is about the ways of electing the Constitutional Tribunal. So rather than do it in a US style where you have to have two powers coming, say the president and the Senate together, or say Italian way in which you have tripartite division of the Constitutional Tribunal and different bodies elect them, it is all by the parliament. But in the end, I believe that it is all at the margins. And it may be significant when the level of assault upon constitutional democracy is relatively low, where it's more a talk rather than actual dismantlement, perhaps like in Slovenia under Janša. But if the war against institutions by authoritarians is fierce and beyond certain threshold, no amount of constitutional design can help, because they can do anything. Okay, so you have tripartite way of, like in Romania, for example, and I point here at Vlad, of appointing constitutional tribunal, so you will dominate all these three forces. So you will take over Council of Judiciary or the Senate or whatever. These are, in the end, these are parchment barriers. And therefore, I believe, I have written an article some time ago about but not that long time ago, about the relative irrelevance of constitutional design. In the end, this is about people and about interpersonal understandings about what counts as the breach of the Constitution. And we cannot, it's a little bit like, you cannot protect your house fully against burglars, and these are constitutional burglars, So what you place them outside the constitutional framework, so they will come and assault those institutions anyway. There is no. I don't believe in the precautions. When it comes to the use of history by PiS, of course, it's a very, very big thing. And there is a huge now literature going on about it in Poland, including by former speakers in this series invited by Grzegorz, that is Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking some time ago. You must know about it. And elsewhere, I have written a little bit about the cynical use that Polish government, PiS government, made of this Holocaust, not Holocaust denial, or sort of attribution to Polish nation of the responsibility of Holocaust. Yeah, the Holocaust law. It was pure populism and nationalism. And here, strangely enough, at certain point, Polish populism came in tandem with Netanyahu populism, because he actually endorsed a declaration and so on. I didn't mention it here because it was, consistently with my project of focusing on institutions rather than on discourse. You point rightly at Vlad. I went because there could have been many other examples in which Polish government uses cynically that type of xenophobic or paranoidal or nationalistic discourse, not just vis-a-vis Israel, not just about Jews and the Holocaust, also in its weaponizing of anti-Islamic attitudes in Poland, and religious bigotry, which basically resulted in huge resistance of the population against participating in the distribution of refugees in Europe. So there's plenty more that can be said about, or rather against, Polish government, which I haven't mentioned.
Professor Mayer.
Yes.
I still have a question over there, but thank you. This was very clear, and it's sort of the anatomy of populism. I'm a historian. My question is, why at the moment of whenever you want to say the 80s, 90s, 2000, does this phenomenon appear in so many places at the same time? And I think we have to find an answer to some overriding conditions which may not be supply or demand. I mean, I could suggest some, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Professor Mayer, I'd rather listen to your suggestion, but let me make some. So first of all, I think that we cannot fully discount the copycat type of attitude or the force of imitation. Okay, one country has done something which by other would-be autocrats seems like an attractive way, so we'll simply use their script. When I had mentioned here this right-wing international, which began emerging partly under the sponsorship of Polish and Hungarian government, but partly funded by Putin before the war. And the war had somehow stopped it, but I don't believe that it has fully put an end to it. So yes, there is imitation and copycat type of phenomenon. And actually there is an interesting thing which many of you may not yet know because it's something very recent. 3 days ago, Polish Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs said we had very good consultations with the Israeli government, which asked us to advise about some aspects of judicial reform. So Netanyahu government asks Morawiecki, well, can you give us some advice about judicial reform? We also want to make judges less political, and more impartial, and so on. So there is this phenomenon there. But everything else, I firmly believe that we should really adopt this framework of plurality of populisms and not try to believe that the sources of populism, say in Venezuela, are more or less the same as in India, or the same as in the United States, or the same as in Hungary. I think they have completely different sources, while they institutionally converge on similar matters, because in the end there's a very limited set of institutional options. It's not unlimited. Or infinite.
They happen at the same time. We're going to have to excuse ourselves. We have a friend coming in at the airport, but thank you.
Thank you.
I would suggest we should look a little at also just what we might call globally neoliberalism and the reaction to it as a type of underarching or under-supporting condition.
Okay.
Transition to an information.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, let me push
Yes.
you a little bit into more
Optimistic direction.
It was meant to be optimistic. Was there anything pessimistic in my presentation?
If we assume that number of things happened recently, and you listed some of them, rift between Poland and Hungary, Brexit debacle, which everyone realizes now, EU determination to defend the fundamental values, Putin aggression, which, as you mentioned, undercut the support for right-wing movements in Europe, and then division within those populist movements precisely regarding Putin and the war and so on. Can we risk a statement that populism is on decline now, that we are kind of moving because of those developments into a situation in which being a populist is going to be tough?
Yeah, well, there is this position which can be and has been expressed. My Polish friend Sławek Sierakowski, who is the leader of a journal and a movement called Political Critique, has published a column in Project Syndicate when he says that now, especially after and as a result of Putin's war, populism is on decline. Perhaps, but it's still too early to tell. And I'm, of course, most concerned about Poland, and I do not see that many reasons to be more optimistic than I was in my presentation. But I would say that, you know, if one was to put together a list of sources of optimism, say for Poland, then the best way perhaps to go about it is to say in what ways Poland is not like Hungary. And these are sources of optimism, because Kaczynski tried to make Poland like Hungary, and it was his declared aim, and he failed almost miserably on the issues such as the power of local government, local self-government. All, but I mean all Polish major cities have anti-peace, anti-law and justice mayors, all, including the capital city. So it's a little bit like in Hungary, it's just Budapest, you know, and his power, Karkaszony was his name, are relatively low. In Poland, powers of city mayors are still very high, even though the government tries to erode their financial basis. So that's one aspect. Another aspect are independent NGOs. You know, these Polish NGOs still are not stigmatized as foreign agents if they get money from abroad. And there are some quite powerful ones, including, and this is my declaration of bias, to where I'm on the program bodies, that is Institute of Public Affairs and the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. I mean, we managed to maintain our independence and continue doing good work. And finally, important commercial, private, independent media, both broadcast media and print media in Poland, which can boast very high degree of viewership or readership. So all these aspects have not been colonized by the state. I fear that these will be three main fronts of the battle after, if, God forbid, peace wins the re-election, or if it wins re-election together in coalition with Confederacja. So, but this, for the time being, you know, we can be satisfied at least, you know, at least we are not like Hungary. And certainly we are not like Turkey. That's why, I'm sorry, I'm still using the old nomination, because I cannot pronounce the new one. Turkey? Turkey. Okay, I prefer Turkey. So, but Poland, Turkey in my language is not a populist authoritarian state, because one of the definitions of populist authoritarianism, which I didn't go into it, is a relatively low level of state violence. While Turkey, I think, has passed this threshold more towards something like Belarus or Russia than something like Poland, where the level of violation of individual liberties is relatively low. And I'm saying it as a harsh critic of the government, you know, and the level of state violence is relatively low. That is what makes this government populist, because they do not want to be feared. They prefer to be loved, and if they cannot be loved, at least they want to be. They want to create apathy among the population, but certainly not fear.
Thank you so much. Please join me to thank Professor.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Wonderful discussion. There is a lot of things going at the Center for European Studies, so please do come back and have a great evening.
Thank you.